डॉक्टर बाबा साहेब आंबेडकर ओपन यूनिवर्सिटी।
Namaskar. My name is Devarshi Modi. I'm serving as an assistant professor in the Department of English, School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Baba Saheb Ambedkar Open University. I would like to welcome you all to attend the lecture on various forms of literate poetry. Dear friends, in this paper, as you can see on your screen, it's titled as the study of poetry, which is there in the T.Y.B.A English syllabus. We will going to see the introduction to the various forms of poetry. As we know that poetry as an art form predates literacy. In pre-literate societies, poetry was frequently employed as a means of recording oral history, storytelling, genealogy, law and the other forms of expression or knowledge that modern societies might expect to be handled in prose. The Ramayana, a Sanskrit epic which includes poetry, was probably written in the 3rd century BC in language described by William Jones as more perfect than Latin, more copious than Greek, and more exquisitely refined than either. Poetry is also often closely identified with liturgy in these societies, as the formal nature of poetry makes it easier to remember priestly incantations or prophecies. The greater part of the world's sacred scriptures are made up of poetry rather than prose. Poetry, as it's derived from the Greek word poiko, which means create. A poet is one who creates. Poetry in itself is a creation of imagination, thoughts, feelings, and various other kind of emotions that one may have. A poet is therefore a creator who through his imagination interprets life and arouses feeling of delight, sorrow, amusement, or introspection in the reader. The ultimate aim of poetry is to give pleasure. Dear friends, in this today's lecture, we're going to see, dear friends, the objectives of this entire lecture is to discuss the various concepts of poetry. What is poetry in general? As Wordsworth defined, poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling, emotion recollected in tranquility. The main objective of this entire lecture is to discuss the various concept of poetry, to understand different elements of poetry, to understand the forms of poetry, various definitions related to this term, various characteristics of poetry, and how did poetry originate and then later develop as a form. It may use condensed or compressed form to convey emotion or the ideas to readers or listeners' mind or ear. It may also use devices such as assonance and the repetition to achieve the musical or the incantatory effects. Poems frequently rely to their effect on imagery, word association, and the musical qualities. Dear friends, as we have discussed about the origin of the poetry, we now will going to see various definitions of the poetry given throughout the history by various poets. As we can see, Thomas Hardy says about the poetry as poetry is emotion put into measure. Poetry is a language of emotion and the passions. how truly he says that poetry expresses our emotions and the passions. How we can forget the Wordsworth while we are talking about poetry? As he says in his famous work, Preface to Lyrical Ballad, which was published in 1802, wherein Wordsworth has given various aspects of poetry. He has also talked about the ideal qualities of a poet. Wordsworth had also talked about various forms of poetry. Wordsworth has given the idea of, for the first time in the history of English literature, the diction of the poetry. And according to Wordsworth, a poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It originates from the emotion recollected in tranquility. Therefore, we may come to this conclusion after looking at various definitions that poetry is a metrical form. The presence of meter, rhythm, and rhyme distinguishes poetry from the prose. Though there exist many good poems that do not have the meters. In fact, in earlier times, in the primitive times, the prose was written in the form of poetry. If you look at the 14th and the 15th, 16th century dramas, till the 17th or 18th centuries, we find in the history of English literature that various prose writings were also written in the form of poetry. But what actually makes poetry very interesting and pleasurable is the meter, rhyme, rhythm, which provides aesthetic qualities, aesthetic pleasure to the poetry. Friends, we are also going to see various elements of the poetry. What makes poetry actually beautiful? So we have rhyme, rhythm, meter, poetic diction, figurative and the connotative devices, poetic truth, poetic license. What is rhythm? Rhythm is what it manifests itself in a harmonic appearances, accents and halls. What is rhyme then? In general, rhyme refers to the similar sounds produced by the words at the end of a line poetry. Meter. Meter is a definite distribution of the syllables in order to produce a harmonious effect. In English literature, we find, in English language in general, we find that there are various meters that make the poetry more beautiful. In fact, in the later episodes of this entire, or in the later series of this entire forms of poetry, we will be looking at various meters that makes English poetry more beautiful and more appealing. Poetic diction. For the first time in the literature, in the English literature, the idea of the poetic definition or poetic diction was given by Wordsworth and his fellow Coleridge. Poetic diction describes the manner in which language is used in the poetry. As Wordsworth says, the ideal language of the poetry should be rural or the rustic language, which appeals the emotions in general. It is considered to be a prerequisite of poetry, but not of the prose. Figurative or the connotative devices refers to the various figurative and the connotative devices which are used to write the poetry, which enhances the imagination of the reader. Poetic truth is something that poet presents to the world. While we read several poems, we find that what actually the meaning of this poetry, or what actually the logic behind this poetry. But as Aristotle says in his Poetics, that poetry is something, the art in general is something which is definitely an imitation, but which adds artistic quality to the work. So that aesthetic pleasure which poet present as a poetic truth in his or her poetry gives aesthetic pleasure to the reader. Poetic license is the freedom taken by a poet to bend the conventions of the diction. So these are few of the key elements which makes any of the poem more beautiful than what we understand. In order to experience the beauty of the poetry, one must understand these key elements. Moving forward, as we are going to talk about the main objective of this entire course is to understand the various forms of in fact, the syllabus of this paper refers to the various forms. You will also going to learn the sonnets, selective sonnets are there. You'll also going to learn dramatic monologues. You'll also going to learn various other forms and how to read, how to analyze the poem. This is what the ultimate aim of our syllabus. But anyways, we are now looking at the classification of poetry. Poetry can be subjective and the objective at a time. What is objective poetry? In primitive time, people used to be quite objective. Objective in terms of they were more interested into the surroundings. They were more interested into the societies that they were living. They were more interested into the nature that they were living in. So objective poetry is something in which the poet is detached from his or herself and what he is writing. It's quite impersonal in manner. Objective poetry is what? It's impersonal in manner. And the actions and the passions of the other poet with little reference to his or her own self and the personal feelings. Here, I would like to quote T.S. Eliot's The Idea of the Impersonality in the Poetry. We're also going to see this very idea in the criticism in his treatise, Tradition and the Individual Talent. T.S. Eliot describes how the poetry should be. And according to him, the ideal poet is one who is quite impersonal while writing the poetry. And anyways, the ultimate aim of the literature in general is to represent the mirror of the society. Literature functions as the mirror of the society and poetry as one of the earliest forms of literature. The other form of the poetry which we're going to see is the subjective poetry. What is subjective poetry? The subjective poetry is the reflections of the poet's own personal feelings and experiences. We also find in literature that there are various poems wherein while we analyze those poems, we see that how poets have given personal ideas, personal feelings, and personal emotions at most important while they were writing these poems. Say, for example, we must have read the poems of Coleridge, Wordsworth, Dryden, Matthew Arnold, Tennyson. These were the poets who were writing poetry of subjective in nature, giving more importance to the personal thoughts, feelings, emotions, and urging need to share them with the world. So friends, as we have seen, poetry can be of two types, either objective and subjective. Now, based on the various elements and based on the types of the poetry, we can move for or we can further categorize poetry into these various forms. In this entire paper, we will be going to look at various forms with their examples in detail. As I mentioned, poetry can be objective at a time and the subjective at a time. So, while we are talking about the objective poetry, so we have this list of objective poetries named as ballad, epic, metrical romances, dramatic monologues, and limerick. These are various names of the objective poetry. While talking about the subjective poetries, we have lyric, odes, elegies, idyll, sonnets, and epistles. So, friends, in the next lecture, we'll dive deep into all these forms with the examples, how the structure of these forms are, how these forms can be understand in a better manner, experience in a better manner. While we are reading any piece of poetry, we must have the idea about which kind of form we are referring to in order to understand the literature in a better manner. And with this note, I end my talk today. We are going to meet in the next session and we'll continue with the same to understand the various forms and details. Till then, take care. Have a great day ahead. Have a great time ahead. And we are meeting soon. Thank you.